Welcome to episode number 25 with world-renowned business creativity expert, Michael Michalko.
Van Gogh, when he started painting, he was terrible, awful. He had no talent, and he had no schooling. And his uncle, who was a commercial artist, told his father to tell your son to give it up. He's a no talent. He's in his 20s now, and he needs to go out and get a job. And Van Gogh said to himself, I will be an artist, and I intend to be an artist, and I'm going to be an artist because I'm going to paint every single day of my life until I am an artist. And it's going through the motions that you learn through trial and error, just doing it over and over again, and then you get this desire to learn more, and you find out more as you go through your life. And then finally, he ends up painting prolifically. The last, 10 years of his life, he painted a picture just about every single day. And his attitude was, I will work harder than anyone else. That's how I'm going to become the greatest artist, because no one will work as hard as I do. And Michelangelo said the same thing, more or less. He said, people look at me and they think I'm a god, and I'm some kind of divine creature because of what I create. He said anybody can be me if they're willing to do the work. It's when you look at geniuses and what they left behind in their logs and journals, you'll find that the vast majority of these people, of what they produced, was bad. More bad poems are written by the major poets than by the minor poets, simply because creative geniuses are very prolific. They work at what they do until they achieve what they, or come as close as they can to what they think they're capable of doing.
Hello, and you are listening to Bill Murphy's Red Zone podcast. If you are listening for the first time, I interview leaders who inspire me in the areas of hardcore IT security, IT business leadership, innovation, creativity, entrepreneurship, and fearless living principles. Welcome to the show. Welcome back to the program, everybody. This is Bill Murphy, your host of the Red Zone podcast. Today, we're going to dive into creativity. For the second time, internationally acclaimed creativity expert Michael Michalko joins me to discuss his creative thinking techniques that have inspired business thinkers around the world to create innovative ideas, creative strategies they need to achieve unimaginable success in today's business environment that is both complex and uncertain. He often says, change the way you look at things, and the things you look at change. If you always think the way you've always thought, you'll always get what you've always got. The same old ideas over and over again will not work. The future belongs to those business thinkers who embrace change, break new ground, forge new paths, and transform the way they think. Discover how to look at the same information as everyone else and see something different by using creative thinking techniques and strategies that creative geniuses have used throughout history. Michael understands some of the top geniuses of all times, and he gets into concepts like developing idea quotas, understanding the difference between pattern recognition and creativity, using techniques like conceptual blending and combinatory play, how to set a goal of 10 ideas per day, and the concept of deathbed decision-making. So you're going to get a lot of interesting concepts, a lot of new ideas. Your brain is definitely going to be firing in different angles and definitely laterally thinking by the end. So you're going to enjoy this. Take out a pencil and paper. And with that, I'd like to introduce you to Michael Michalko. I promise you, we are almost there. I have a special request today. The show is not brought to you by anybody today, but I just have a special request from the audience, from you, the listener. Feedback on iTunes is incredibly important. The podcasting medium is exploding in popularity, and I want people to be able to find the programming that we're putting on, that I'm putting on for you. And the ratings and the high ratings go a long way of iTunes, whatever their rating algorithm is. It's clearly determined by how the quality of the shows and the ratings that each one are getting. Additionally, if you would go to either the blog post that supports this particular show, number 25, under Michael Michalko, leave your comments either at redzonetech.net/podcast, or you can go on LinkedIn. And additionally, there's a comments section there under LinkedIn, Bill Murphy, Red Zone. You can find me in the Washington, D.C. area. Go there and you can leave comments as well. I love to get feedback from the audience, find out what's going really well related to the show, what you'd like to see more of, because right now it's kind of a guessing game, and I like it to be able to tune a little bit the programming for what you're looking for. So with that, now we're really going to get into the show.
Creative genius is left behind, hundreds of logs and journals and estimates as to how they got their ideas. The actual process, their habits, their strategies, their creative thinking techniques. Yet no one at school, you don't learn any of this. They'll talk about the geniuses and their ideas and their accomplishments, and then they imply that these people are special people and that creativity is a property that you either have or don't have, and the majority of people don't have it. And this is really what has killed a lot of creativity in most people. Most people run around saying, I'm not creative. Well, that's because they've never even tried or to learn how to become creative. They haven't learned the habits, the skills, and the techniques. And that gives them an easy out, and they become cognitively lazy and just tell everybody, I'm not creative. I can't come up with ideas. And I'll default to whatever I've learned in the past.
It's interesting because a lot of the people listening to this, Michael, have become very, very specialized in areas, and they're very deep. And I love the point. And maybe if you can talk about this, is becoming really great in your field, I guess, would enable someone to have what you call pattern recognition, but that's very different than creativity. Maybe you could explain that.
Yeah, because the more expert you become, the less creative you become. What happens is you have a theory about life, and you become an expert in that theory. And then you have a hypothesis. Now, your theory determines what you observe in life. So the only thing that these experts end up observing are things that confirm their theory. Now, when they're confronted with a radical idea, their first thought is, does this confirm what I believe? And if it doesn't, they will look for ways why it can't work or can't be done. And that's why all these new radical ideas and innovations are usually turned down by the experts. Like Chester Carlson, when he invented xerography in 1938, every major corporation turned down xerography because they said, experts say no one will ever buy an expensive copy machine because carbon paper is so cheap and plentiful. Their theory was, why would people pay a lot of money to make copies when they've got carbon paper? And they refused to look at the copy machine. When Univac invented the computer, they refused to talk to any company that wanted to develop it for business because they said, this was invented for scientists and only has scientific uses. And along came IBM. Then IBM, with their experts, they went out to see if there was a market for personal computers. And the experts came back and said, there are only 6 people on Earth who would ever buy a personal computer. And along comes Apple. It's the history of business. The more we have hundreds and thousands of MBAs out there now. These MBA schools are churning them out every year, but no MBA has started a new industry or a new business that I know of. All the new radical innovations come from people who know less but see more. They see more because they're thinking naturally and spontaneously, and they've learned how to get ideas. And they're self-taught, like Steve Jobs and Bill Gates and Fred Smith. They're self-taught.
So when people are developing ideas. What I thought was interesting was this concept of, and I practiced it as I was reading the book. I was practicing this concept you have of conceptual blending.
Blending, right.
And I was trying to, so I was having, let's say, a problem that I would write down on a piece of paper and then take something that was completely not relevant to it and then develop, and you had a method of doing this. And it was actually quite challenging for my brain to do it. And I'm assuming it would get easier over time, but I could see, maybe you could explain it and just see how
right.
that would work.
Yeah, it's like when I decided to write a book years ago, I went to publishers, and publishers said, we will not look at a manuscript unless you're represented by an agent. And I went to agents, and the agents said, we do not represent anyone who is not published. So it's catch-22. Now, Leonardo da Vinci, in his journals, wrote about connecting the unconnected. He said he discovered that you cannot think of two subjects, no matter how dissimilar they are, simultaneously without connections being made. And most of these connections lead nowhere. But occasionally you'll get the connection that will give you the idea that you need, that you can't get using your conventional way of thinking. So I use that technique, and this is conceptual blending with random objects. I had a deck of tarot cards, and I randomly selected a card. The card I selected was death. Now, what does death have to do with getting a publisher to look at my manuscript? I listed all the features and aspects of death. You know, the gravestone, the mourning, the wakes, the funerals, the eulogies, everything I could think of that was related to death. And the more connections you make, the more associations and future connections, your mind continues to work. It incubates all this information. Your subconscious mind never stops working. I did this for about 2 weeks off and on. And one day I'm walking down the street and it suddenly hit me. Death means leaving one's friends and loved ones behind. I went to the library and I got the Publishers Industry Journal, Publishers Weekly, and I found a section that said people on the move. And it would say Bill Jones, editor at Harper and Row, has moved on to become editor-in-chief at Scribner's. Now, I would write Harper and Row, his old company, a letter to the editor-in-chief at Harper and Row, a letter that stated, Dear Editor-in-Chief, the manuscript that Bill Jones was so hot after is finished. However, I cannot find Bill. Please let me know how I can get in contact with him so I can get him this manuscript that he's so interested in. And I did that to 10 companies, and they were calling me in the middle of the night, now threatening me with a lawsuit unless I give them my manuscript to look at. And they got into a bidding war over the manuscript, and now I've got companies who, decline to even look at it, now begging to pay a lot of money to get it. Now, that's kind of idea you can't get using your usual way of thinking. And that's conceptual blending with random objects. And you'll find that many breakthrough ideas come from combining things in novel ways. And Dean Keith Simonton at the University of California, he defined geniuses are people who can combine things in more novel ways than the average talented person. It's combinatory play, which is what Einstein called it, when he combined images in his mind. If something does not come from nothing, your ideas come from something. And you have all these thoughts in your subconscious mind, or you cultivate new thoughts and ideas by connecting dissimilar things.
So what, from a random example, if a person listening had a problem, let's say they were in charge of information technology security at a company, and and they knew that their job was to protect from hackers from
Right.
Russia or China or wherever it may be. And they knew this was a big challenge. And what would be an example of like combinatory play or coming up with novel ideas? Like what questions could they ask themselves to kind of spur that imagination?
Okay, what the example I gave you, that was using something randomly. Now, what I would do in terms of national security, I would say to myself, what is the essence of the problem? And the essence of the problem could be protecting. How are things protected? Now look around the world and other worlds. Look at nature. How are things protected in nature? You look at the world of sports. How are things protected in sports? And you list all these other things that are protected in other worlds. How are things protected in religion? And then you look for something that you can metaphorically connect to your problem. Like the Mistral, the man who invented Velcro, he was hired to improve the zipper. But he didn't think in terms of the objective reality of a zipper, because if you think of improving the zipper, you exclude most of the information from your consciousness. You're only thinking about material of zippers, what zippers are, everything you know about a zipper. You confine yourself to that. You have limited your options. But if you think about fastening, how do things fasten in different worlds? How do things fasten in nature and other worlds? And one day he's walking through the brush with his dog, and a burdock attaches itself to his trouser. And he's thinking, a burdock, how does that fasten to my leg? And the purpose of that fastening is that that's the way they move their seeds to other environments, by attaching themselves to something passing by and then being relieved at a future spot. So he studied the burdock, all these little hooks and loops, and he thought, so this is how the burdock fastens to me. Now, how can I use this principle in the zipper? And he experimented with different fabrics, and he came up with one fabric that had one side with loops and one side with hooks, and he invented Velcro. And Velcro came out of that, which is not a zipper, but that oftentimes when you are looking for an idea, when you are looking with the essence of the idea, of the principle of the idea, and looking for correlates in other worlds, you will come up with a whole brand new breakthrough category, which is what he did.
That was fascinating. And then also what I find a really fun story was the story about the employee suggestion system combined with the New York Stock Exchange.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's another example. Another example is the man he was working on internet security, and he was thinking about tracing someone's dentures on the internet. And he was thinking, how do things follow? How do things search? And he thought about, different worlds, and he's thinking about ants. How do ants find food? And then researching ants, he discovered that the ants deposit a chemical trail, pheromones, I think they're called. And what they do is follow the chemical trail of other ants to the target. And then he came up with a way to electronically create this kind of electronic trail on the internet. So now I think the Defense Department has employed this already, but it's a way that you can electronically track where somebody else has been on the internet, every single space or spot they've gone to.
Actually, that was a fascinating story. I actually looked him up online, that gentleman you're talking about. I have him saved. Now I turn off my phone during these interviews because it tends to ring a lot. But which is interesting about combining the ants is in leaving the traces. Essentially, just was awarded like $1 million contract for big data research for a firm,
Right.
because that's a huge piece. My audience can appreciate that, but it's interesting how he combined something from nature,
Sure.
ants, to really a technology, to a problem of in technology.
Right. There's another technological change that came about the same way. I can't think of the man's name. He's Chinese. But he was thinking a way how to better organize information on the internet. How does information organize and flow on the internet? How do things flock and flow? So he looked around the world and studied birds. How do birds flock and flow? And then he came up with a way, an algorithm, to have documents and words, patterns of words, search out other similar items and join that flock on the internet. And I don't think this thing has been implemented yet, or his idea has been implemented yet. But you'll be able to, if you join one flock, it will bring you to related flocks on the internet, just as flocks of birds move south in the wintertime, but using that principle. And then another discovery was made when a person was studying how molecules flow in liquid, and discovered how they organize when they reach an obstacle, how they separate and take turns in going around the obstacle. And he discovered that the way to avoid a riot when a fire erupts in a theater and people all rush to the one exit trying to get out at the same time is to put some kind of a barrier before the door or the exit, forcing people to go into two lines and then one after the other going out the door more slowly but safely.
One of the pieces that was interesting for me is the section that you had on teaching people how to see. I think you had mentioned Leonardo da Vinci was one of the folks that really spent a lot of time, and you had this concept of melted butter in our brain. Basically, if you pour water on that melted butter, it forms like like these grooves, right? And that the water will always go down that groove unless we come up with a new groove.
That's right. And it takes, after a while, it takes only a small bit of information for that groove to be activated. Have you seen that thing on the internet where you have a paragraph of jumbled letters about the Cambridge University research?
I probably have seen it. I off the top of my head, I don't remember.
Well, it's a paragraph of jumbled letters, but you can read it, even though they're not words.
Yes. No. That was fascinating. I know exactly what you're talking about. That was the one where basically you had I think you even had the book. You had a full paragraph, but none of the words.
Right.
They were all just combined. The words were kind of changed,
right?
But you could read it.
That's an example of the patterns in your mind. Your word pattern in your mind only needs the first and last letter of a word, and it will automatically assume that it's the word that you think it is, even though it's not. Like if you showed that to a preschooler and said, read this, the preschooler would say, you're crazy. Those are jumbled words. It's only the educated people who can read that because this word pattern is being triggered automatically with a small amount of information.
It's almost dangerous in some respects because you're basically assuming that the way I've learned it in the past, the way we've always done things is the way.
That's right.
Is the way it should be, when that's the enemy of creative thought and new thought.
Right. You're exactly right. Let me try something, Bill.
Okay.
I'm going to ask you to add these numbers mentally in your head. Don't write them down. Just do it mentally.
Okay.
Okay. Add 40 to 1,000. Add another 1,000. Add another 30. Add another 1,000. Add another 20. Add another 1,000. Add another 10. What do you have?
Around 14,000 or so?
No, we'll try it again, okay?
Okay.
1,000,
Okay.
add 40,
Yep.
add 1,000, add 30, add 1,000, add 20, add 1,000, add another 10. What do you have?
6,000.
No, you have 4,100.
4,100. Okay.
Because what that is, we're taught to add in base 10.
Yeah.
In that series of numbers, we don't even realize how we're adding numbers mentally. That base 10 program has difficulty with that arrangement of numbers.
Good thing I'm not a math major, huh?
Yeah. It's amazing. 98% of the people will come up, the usual answer they come up with is 5,000.
Okay.
But the right answer is 4,100. And it's just absolutely amazing how these thinking patterns work. I'll try another one. I'm going to ask you to say a word.
Okay.
Out loud 3 times, loud. Then I'm going to ask you a question, and you answer that question as fast as you can, okay?
Okay.
The word I want you to repeat 3 times out loud is silk.
Silk. Silk. Silk.
What is milk called? What does a cow drink?
Milk.
A cow drinks milk?
No, it doesn't. It drinks water.
No, I formed a little thinking pattern with one word.
That's
we automatically assume, because these thinking patterns are so automatic. When somebody says, "What's 6 times 6?" we say 36. We don't even think about it. And these patterns are automatically delivering up this information all the time. And the more expert you become in your field, the more of these patterns, the deeper these patterns are, and the harder it is for an expert to appreciate the value of a new idea. And that's why experts in business are usually wrong, and why Einstein said, if you want to do something, ask an expert if it can be done. If he says no, go ahead and do it. Another thing he said was, an expert is somebody who has very few new ideas.
So, assuming that most of the people listening will have some expertise, whatever that may be, what's a good way, what do you tell people and how to start? Do you start with a journal? Do you start with a series of questions in a journal? How do you make it actually turn the motivation that we're talking about into actual practical reality?
Okay, you have to go through the motions. And the motions, like when you want an idea, sit down and write every idea and thought in a list. List everything in writing. And then another thing you can do is give yourself an idea quota. Say, I'm going to write ideas until I reach 60 ideas. And that will force you to stretch your imagination. The first third will usually be the usual third you come up with, and the next third will be more interesting. And the last third, you're really stretching now to meet the quota. And after you listed all the ideas, a way to trigger still more ideas is now to go back and ask the list of scamper questions about each idea. Look at the idea and say, what can I substitute? Can I combine this with something else? What can be adapted to it? Can I magnify, add to it, modify it, change it, put it to some other use, eliminate, or reverse it? And you'll find the ideas will start popping up now almost involuntarily. Now you have all these ideas now listed, and you're not evaluating or judging any of these ideas. You now have them out in front of you. And now you can go through and evaluate those that you think are most worthwhile. Then set it aside and forget about it for a day or so. And let the information incubate in your subconscious mind. Your subconscious mind works 24 hours a day. Now you have fed it some things that you have observed, and let your subconscious mind combine and recombine all of these thoughts and ideas in a trillion different ways. Then when you come back to it, you'll find yourself with a whole new array of new ideas from all these combinations your subconscious mind has occurred. And then you capture these ideas in an idea log. Keep a log of your ideas, a workbook of sorts. And Edison, he left behind 3,500 notebooks detailing every single idea session he ever had. And what he would do with these idea logs is, after he found a practical idea to try and develop, he would go through unconventional ways of looking at that idea. He might try to look at the essence of the idea and think metaphorically. He might look at the opposite. What is the opposite of this? Can I make the opposite work in some way? Constantly asking himself probing questions. And whenever he succeeded with an invention, a new invention, he would go back through all his notebooks to see what he has learned, if he could apply that to something that he had failed at in the past. Or when he was stonewalled on working on a new project, he would go through his notebooks to see if there was something in the past that he had worked on or thought about that he could use. When he was working on a telephone transmitter, for example, he was stonewalled and went back over his notebooks and discovered the work he did on an underwater seas cable using the principle of variable resistance. Now, that was a failed idea, but he took the principle of variable resistance, put it into the transmitter, and it became the industry standard. And the other thing he would do would be to use his notebooks as springboards for new ideas. He would look at his work that he did on the telephone, and then he thought about sounds being transmitted, why not sounds being recorded, and invented the phonograph. Then he looked at the phonograph years later and thought, sounds being recorded, how about images being recorded, and then invented the motion picture camera.
I thought that just a couple comments on that list you went through. The imagining yourself inside the problem, I thought, was pretty useful for me, because for example, I'm just go back to IT security for a moment, but if you can imagine yourself inside the Ethernet cables, inside the equipment, inside the software, and you're almost observing the enemy, and from a different angle, you are the digital transmission. It's a very creative way of looking at the problem, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And becoming the problem. We should look at approach a problem on its own terms by looking at it with multiple perspectives. You look at it from your perspective, and then you might imagine yourself as a problem. Now look at it from that perspective. And then look at it from the perspective of other people. Take the role of, say, imagine you are Einstein. How would Einstein look at this? Or some other historical figure. But
you had a great one for the hospital. Sorry to interrupt you there. You had the hospitals would have a human error problem, and then you said, to the point you just made, imagine yourself as like Einstein or a priest or a pilot. How would they deal with the human error problem?
Yep. Yeah, that was a doctor who came up with the checklist idea. Our words shape the way we think, too. We often don't think about the words that we use because, again, these are automatically triggered with our thinking patterns. But if you change your words, you change your perspective. Like one year, Toyota put out a sign, and it was, how can we become more productive? Nobody came up with any suggestions. They changed the wording to, how can we make our jobs easier? And they came up with hundreds of suggestions.
Just with one simple shift made that change?
Yeah. I remember once I was staying at the Ritz-Carlton in Montreal, and I usually don't like staying at the Ritz because I think it's way overpriced. And I felt good at this particular Ritz, and I couldn't imagine why. And so finally, when I checked out, I went to see the manager and I said, look, I usually feel bad staying here because you people charge way too much for what you get. But here, I felt good and don't understand why. And he said, because of the language that we use. He said, we have trained our employees to never use negatives in their language, to always frame everything they say in a positive way. So when somebody does something for you at the hotel, you'll not hear them say, when you thank them, you'll not hear them say something like, it's no problem. They'll always say, it's a pleasure, or something like that. And he said, the bartenders do, and the waiters do, and the waitresses do, and the bellmen do, and the desk people do. And he said, what we found is, because we're doing it, customers began emulating that, and they began speaking that way. And when everybody in this environment is speaking using that kind of framework for language, everybody feels good. And it's true. You become what you pretend to be. That's another thing with the creative people who think they are creative. They become creative because they believe they are, and they will learn the skills and they will learn the habits and strategies and techniques. But the big thing is, you look at the dynamics of creative people, you can see in the dynamics of their behavior, their language, their attitude, their compulsion, their persistence. It's right there in front of you. Most of them live a very joyful, happy life because they feel really good all the time about what they're doing.
To the point about that, the words that we use, you also had a point about intention. What I really thought, I was wondering if you could hit upon is, you had made the point about intention, but then you were talking about our genes expressing, via neurotransmitters, expressing creativity. And I was hoping you could just expand on that a little bit, because I found that very, very interesting from the brain point of view.
Well, intention is important. If all art is a reaction to the first line drawn. If you don't draw that first line, there is no art. And it's the same thing with the way we live our lives. If we never act, we never achieve anything. And if you do nothing, you are nothing. What we think and what we believe are of no significance. The only thing of significance in life is what we do. And to do anything, you have to have the intention to do it. And once you have the intention and the persistence, you can accomplish what you set out to do. Like Van Gogh, when he started painting, he was terrible, awful. He had no talent, and he had no schooling. And his uncle, who was a commercial artist, told his father to tell your son to give it up. He's a no talent. He's in his 20s now, and he needs to go out and get a job. And Van Gogh said to himself, I will be an artist, and I intend to be an artist, and I'm going to be an artist because I'm going to paint every single day of my life until I am an artist. And it's going through the motions that you learn through trial and error, just doing it over and over again. And then you get this desire to learn more, and you find out more as you go through your life. And then finally, he ends up painting prolifically. The last, 10 years of his life, he painted a picture just about every single day. And his attitude was, I will work harder than anyone else. That's how I'm going to become the greatest artist, because no one will work as hard as I do. And Michelangelo said the same thing, more or less. He said, people look at me and they think I'm a god, and I'm some kind of divine creature because of what I create. He said anybody can be me if they're willing to do the work. It's when you look at geniuses and what they left behind in their logs and journals, you'll find that the vast majority of these people, of what they produced, was bad. More bad poems are written by the major poets than by the minor poets, simply because creative geniuses are very prolific. They work at what they do until they achieve what they or come as close as they can to what they think they're capable of doing. When you go through the motions, like if you say to yourself, I'm going to come up with, 10 new ideas every day, and do that, you energize your neurotransmitters in your mind, and the connections that you make between the neurons are more and more plentiful, and then it becomes more and more easy. It becomes easier to become creative the more you try to become creative. It's just like painting a picture. It's going through the motions, pretending that you are a creative person and you're going to be a creative person like Van Gogh, and you become it. And
yeah, and I think that's huge, because I think, especially with a lot of my listeners, their strength is on linear sequential thinking and kind of deep thinking. And so to be able to make these creative leaps, just taking a small step like 10 new ideas a day over the span of a year, even if they took weekends off, that would be 200 days times 10, that'd be 2,000 new ideas, of which maybe just a small percentage are useful. But I think that's a huge step, wouldn't it? Don't you think?
Oh, sure. And it's, in a way, it's like Darwinian theory of evolution, the Darwin theory of biological evolution. Nature creates thousands of species, constantly, but most of them do not survive through natural selection. In fact, very few survive. So you need great quantity to get the quality that you're looking for. And then in nature, species that survives has a gene pool, and that gene pool, without variation, is unable to adapt to changing circumstances and will die off. So you need a way also to get variation. Now, nature gets variation through genetic mutations. Genetic mutation is something that happens by chance or randomly or by accident. And again, many of these genetic mutations do not survive, but the few that do are breakthrough species in the way nature creates. And that's natural creativity and humanity, too. You need to learn how to create a great quantity of ideas before you select the few that you think will work. And then you need a way to create genetic mutations, to use unconventional ways of thinking. Like we were talking before about conceptual blending. That's one of the most popular ways creative geniuses throughout history got their mutated ideas. They would conceptually blend two dissimilar subjects together.
I think the conceptual blending, though, is, I consider myself certainly a creative person, and I found that conceptual blending's so powerful, but I felt my brain almost creaking. Like it clearly, those pathways were being stretched, because I would sit there and I would have a problem, for example, like wanting to increase sales or whatever that, it doesn't matter what the problem is, but then I would take the way you coached it through in the book was taking something completely opposite of the problem and then combining those, trying to find linkages between them, which I found really interesting and challenging.
Oh, sure. It's like, list your assumptions that you're making and reverse each assumption, try to make the assumption work. 3M, when they came up with a Post-it note, couldn't sell it. And they were actually thinking about scratching the project and not trying to market Post-it notes. And this one sales manager from the mid-Atlantic states came back and he said, "You're going to think I'm crazy, but the way to sell this is to do the reverse and give it away." And they thought about it, and they decided to experiment with his proposal. And they gave away Post-it notes to all the executive secretaries in the country. And the guy was right, because they were addictive. As soon as the secretary used the notes one time, they were begging for more. So a way to sell was to give it away.
You also, in addition to that 3M example, you had an example which I found pretty interesting, because I went to a Jesuit high school that was founded by St. Ignatius Loyola, and you gave an example with St. Ignatius Loyola about Maybe you could explain the deathbed decision making. I think that's another example of looking at it from reverse, isn't it?
Was that the seminar?
Yeah, I think it was when the decision that you have to make today, looking at it from as if you are from your deathbed.
Oh, yeah.
So looking at it not from going forward point of view, but look at it from reverse.
Right. Imagine yourself in the future and looking back at your life as to, the validity of that decision. Yeah, that's right. It was the deathbed of Ignatius.
So moving forward with some of your projects, what I know education is as a big driver for you, and is that something that's been growing over time? Have you always had this strong conviction?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, see, when I was in school, I was very curious when I was a young student. And I would always ask, the teacher would say, well, Albert Einstein came up with this theory of relativity. And I would say, how did he get the idea? And the answers usually were, well, these people are superior intellects. They're, it's genetically determined. They're geniuses, they're creative, and you're not. And I never bought that. For some reason, I instinctively knew this was a bunch of bull. So I remember one day I had read about, Einstein, who divided 13 many different ways by looking at it many different ways and expressing it many different ways. And it came up in the class that I was in, and I said, 13, the teacher said 6.5. And I said, I raised my hand and I said, there are many different ways you can express a 13 and many different ways you can have things. And I said, for example, I went to the board and I printed out 13 and divided it in half. And I said, now 13, half of 13 is 4. 4 letters on one side, 4 on the other. And then I wrote the numeral 13 and split it in half vertically with a vertical line. And I said, now half of 13 becomes 1 and 3. And then I wrote it in Roman numerals and then vertically split it in half. And I said, now half of 13 becomes 11 and 2. And the teacher said, okay, that's enough. She said, sit down. And from now on, when I ask you a question, I want you to give me the answer that you were taught, to stop wasting our time playing these silly games. And I never forgot that. Stop wasting your time with these silly games. In other words, there's only one right answer, the one that you were taught, and to disregard all else. See, we're taught to be exclusive thinkers in that way. When we think, what have I learned on how to solve that problem, and to disregard every other thought that we have. And that is, we're taught there's only one right answer. We're taught there's one thing you never do is fail or make a mistake. And we're taught that the brain is kind of like a computer. You put in all this fixed information and the computer will always turn out the right answer. And creative thinkers don't think that way. The human brain is dynamic. And by that, I mean it can synthesize information. Your brain cannot tell the difference between what is real and what is not real. And Einstein writes about this a lot. He said one day he was imagining himself walking down the street and falling in love. And then 2 weeks later, he's walking down the street and he meets the person he fell in love with 2 weeks before. And out of that came this theory of acausality. Now, that's impossible in reality to happen, but it is possible in your imagination. And from that came a principle that helps us understand the way the universe operates. The other thing in school is we are taught that things are what they appear to be, and that's not, I found in my life, that's not true at all either. Things are what you are. You interpret reality. In other words, all experiences are neutral. They have no meaning. You give it the meaning by the way you interpret it. For example, I'm walking down the street and a girl bumps into me very rudely. Now, I can say, I think that was a deliberate, rude attack by an aggressive feminist. Or I could say, I'm getting older, I should be more careful how I walk. Or I could say, the architect who designed these walkways should account for heavier traffic than he did. Or I could say, I think she's flirting with me. I give it the meaning. It's not the experience. It's me, my interpretation. Now, if I have a positive outlook on life, that's going to be one interpretation. If I have a creative outlook, that'll be another interpretation. But if I'm a pessimist, I get, another interpretation. It's the way you interpret the event that you're seeing. And you see that in the media all over the place. You have all these racial problems in Ferguson, Missouri, and other places, and you got people running around saying Black Lives Matter. And that's the way they interpret a criminal act in Ferguson where a man did not have his hands up, but they believe he did. So they're running around going, hands up, don't shoot, and Black Lives Matter. And when someone says, well, all lives matter, they get upset. No, that's not, only Black Lives Matter. And you get all this dissension because of the way people are interpreting their experiences. And they listen to radical leaders who interpret experiences for them. Before World War II, when you had the American dream and a can-do attitude, that was because the media, mass media, was not around and psychiatry was not around. Abraham Lincoln ran for office 26 times, and he failed 26 times. He was beaten 26 times. And he started a store and he went bankrupt. And then he fell in love with a woman whose family would not let her date Lincoln because he was a lower social class. Lincoln becomes president of the United States, becomes one of our greatest presidents ever. And the journalist says, Abe, when it counts for your character, you're such a strong man. How did you become so strong? Lincoln said, adversity. You must welcome all the adversity you can in your life, because it's by overcoming adversity do you become the person you can become.
Yeah,
and now, of course, that adversity is something to be shunned by the media. The more adversity you have, the more benefit you get, from the government.
We live in a very comfortable culture, and certainly comfort sort of breeds the opposite of adversity and growing through discomfort. I love the knowing, basically, we see no more than we expect to see. That was one of the quotes I wrote down. And you also said perception depends on our own internal assumptions. And so as we're, one of the big things for you is teaching people, that I took away, teaching people how to live a creative life and how to get the linear thinking mindset, how to get people to think in a non-linear fashion. So that comes down to how we see, or the perceptions we have of our own selves.
Right, that's true.
Very, very powerful. And as we wrap up here, Michael, I just want to thank you for your contribution to helping people live teaching them how to live a very creative life, and to give them I know I got a lot of hope from reading it, because I got ideas and suggestions about practical suggestions on how to do that.
Right. Thank you for the compliments.
No, absolutely. No, it's, and I will, on the show notes, Michael, definitely leave for our listeners links to your books, because a lot of the, as people do, if they take the suggestion and write in journal, there's a lot of different suggestions you offer that I think people, as they're listening, will really enjoy, to kind of spur, as they said, maybe a target for themselves of 10 ideas a day. I think that could help out quite a bit. So I'll have links to that so they can have access to your material to learn more.
But it is amazing how people can change. You probably read the story about Salvador Dali, who was morbidly shy as a young boy. He would hide in the cellar when people came to visit his parents. And if you saw him on the street and talked to him, he would turn bright red and would be unable to talk. And one day his uncle came to him and said, "Salvador, I'm going to tell you the secret of life." He said, "The secret in life is to be an actor. Now, if you pretend to be an extroverted artist and go out and talk that way and behave that way, you will become what you pretend." And Salvador took it to heart, and he went out and he started trying to be extroverted in everything he did. And it was very hard at first, and it got easier and easier. And before he knew it, he was this flamboyant, extroverted artist. And then he goes down in history as the most flamboyant, extroverted artist of all time. You become what you pretend to be.
It's a great way to end this, because we actually have to imagine ourselves doing that which we think is the biggest challenge for ourselves.
Right.
And it all starts with that imagining yourself in a doing the things that would be adding this creative spark to our life. If we are not actively doing it, that is in of itself a very a big step. So
right. One of my favorite quotes is, "The artist is not a special person. Each person is a special kind of artist."
Oh, I like that. Well, Michael, thank you very much for your time. This is you're the first person that's come on twice onto this program. So, there's a reason for that. So I really enjoyed our conversation today.
Well, thank you, Bill. I did too.
Well, that wraps up today's episode. I hope you enjoyed Michael's interview with me as much as I did. I learned so much about how to generate ideas, the importance of combining dissimilar topics together to come up with new ideas, why pattern recognition is the enemy of creative thought, the relationship between ants and big data, and how Velcro was invented, and how to know less and see more. There's just so many concepts in here that are just so worth listening to the show, buying his books, and I just appreciate you so much for listening to the program. If you'd like to see more of the show notes, please go to either two spots, redzonetech.net/podcasts, or you can go find me on LinkedIn under Bill Murphy. Bill Murphy Red Zone is probably the best way to find me, or Bill Murphy, Washington, D.C. area, information technology. You'll find me in there. And you'll see that I publish all of the podcasts on LinkedIn as well as on redzonetech.net. So you can see all the show notes, get links to the books, etc. So with that, I can't wait to see you on episode number 26. So there you have it. This wraps another episode of Bill Murphy's Red Zone podcast. To get all the relevant show notes, please go to our blog at www.redzonetech.net/podcast. Additionally, make sure you go to iTunes and leave your comments in iTunes about the show. This helps our show rankings enormously, and it helps support the show. Until next time, I appreciate you very much for listening. Thank you.